In the midst of the Great Depression, with unemployment at an all-time high, a struggling salesman called Charles Darrow invented a board game that would make him a millionaire. It was called Monopoly. His rags-to-riches story was inspirational and gave hope to thousands of families struggling through the 20th century's worst financial crisis. The game is named after the economic concept of a monopoly, the domination of a market by a single entity. Economics professor Ralph Anspach believed that the board game was glorifying monopolies, which in reality are bad for the economy and bad for consumers. In response, he invented a game called Anti-Monopoly in 1973. He quickly sold over 200,000 copies of the game when the makers of Monopoly sued for trademark infringement. In the bitter 10-year legal battle that followed, Anspach would uncover a startling truth about the popular board game. The story behind the game, the story the trademark was based on, was a lie. On October 29, 1929, the United States stock market crashed in a day that became known as Black Tuesday. Billions of dollars were lost, wiping out thousands of investors, many of whom gathered outside the stricken banks in an attempt to withdraw their assets. In the aftermath of that event, America and the rest of the industrialized world spiraled downward into the Great Depression, a 10-year economic slump that affected industrialized countries around the world. International trade fell by more than 50%. Unemployment in the US rose to 25%, and in some countries rose as high as 33%. It was the longest, deepest, and most widespread depression of the 20th century. In 1883, in Salem, Massachusetts, brothers George, Charles, and Edward Parker founded a toy and game company called Parker Brothers. By the end of the century, Parker Brothers was a major force in the game industry. But in 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, the company was on the verge of collapse, until an unemployed salesman approached them with an idea for a new game. He called it Monopoly. The game was first published in 1935, and it was an immediate success. Soon the factory was producing 20,000 units a week, and tucked into the game's box was the story of Charles Darrow, the game's inventor. Darrow was a salesman who lost his job during the Depression. He created Monopoly in 1933 and sold it to Parker Brothers. His tenacity and inventiveness saved him and the New England board game maker from the brink of financial ruin. By Christmas of 1935, Parker Brothers had sold 250,000 copies of the game. 1 year later, that number had grown to nearly 2 million. The royalties from Monopoly made Charles Darrow a millionaire. For families struggling through the Great Depression, Monopoly allowed them to hope that opportunity and wealth were just around the corner, and Darrow's rags-to-riches story was all the proof they needed. 40 years after the height of the Great Depression, the world was rocked by another economic crisis, the 1973 oil crisis. In October of that year, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, led by Saudi Arabia, announced an oil embargo targeted at nations that had supported Israel during 1973's Arab-Israeli War. At the time, OPEC countries had a monopoly on oil production and pricing, and by March of 1974, the price of oil had shot up by 300%, creating shortages around the world. San Francisco State University economics professor Ralph Anspach was watching news coverage of the oil crisis with his 8-year-old son, lamenting the impact the oil monopolists were having on the global economy. His son, an avid Monopoly player who had recently beat his father in a game, told him he was just a sore loser and there was nothing wrong with monopolists. Anspach disagreed. He believed that monopolies were a corrupting force in the economy. It was monopolies that prevented the ideal version of capitalism from flourishing. Not to mention, monopolies are illegal, and antitrust laws exist to prevent monopolies from forming. He realized that the game of Monopoly was teaching his son, and many young people like him, the wrong lesson about free enterprise and the economy. He decided to do something about it. He developed a game called anti-monopoly. The aim of the game is to break up monopolies. It became a counterculture hit, and in the first year, Anspach and his newly formed company, Anti-Monopoly Incorporated, had orders for nearly 1 million games, and they shipped about 200,000 before attracting the attention of Parker Brothers and their lawyers. Charles Darrow had been issued a patent on December 31st, 1935, and signed it over to Parker Brothers. In 1974, the company filed a suit against Ralph Anspach and his company, claiming patent infringement. Anspach attempted to find a compromise, offering to change the name of his game to Anti-Monopolist or Anti-Monopolism, but no, Parker Brothers was determined to forge ahead with legal action. Parker Brothers' first win comes in 1977, when a judge ruled that Anspach had committed trademark infringement. He was ordered to deliver up for destruction any remaining copies of his game. In a demonstration of its corporate power in the David versus Goliath litigation, representatives of Parker Brothers invited the media to Mankato, Minnesota, where anti-monopoly was being manufactured, and buried approximately 40,000 anti-monopoly games in a landfill. But Ralph Anspach didn't give up. To drum up support for anti-monopoly and bring attention to his legal plight, he appeared on a radio show. A listener called into the show saying that she knew someone who played Monopoly long before the Great Depression, long before Darrow's patent. This inspired Anspach to track down these players of pre-Darrow Monopoly and assemble an accurate history of the game, a history that would help prove that Darrow had essentially patented a game like chess or checkers, a long popular game to which he was a latecomer. Ralph Anspach became consumed with telling the truth of what he called the monopoly lie. In 1879, charismatic politician, economist, and firm anti-monopolist Henry George published his best-selling book, Progress and Poverty. He explored the puzzle of increasing poverty and income inequality at a time of unparalleled technological advances and innovation. He believed that individuals should own 100% of what they made or created, but that natural resources, particularly land, should belong to everyone. George advocated for a land value tax, also known as the single tax, the general idea being that taxing land, and only land, could help shift the tax burden from the poor and working class to wealthy landlords. The New York Times reported in 1881 that George had not only put down clearly in black and white the causes of poverty, but had offered a cure. His ideas took hold, and in the US and UK, political movements emerged based on George's single tax ideal. In the early 1900s, Elizabeth Magie became fascinated by Henry George and his ideas. Lizzie was an incredibly progressive woman for her time. She was a writer, a poet, and an inventor. She was also an outspoken activist for feminism and the single tax movement. Dismayed by growing poverty and inequality, Magie saw Georgism as a means to level the playing field. Lizzie Magie was also something of a performance artist and used her creativity and ingenuity to spread her political beliefs. But she wasn't reaching enough people. She needed a new medium, something more interactive. At the turn of the 20th century, a new pastime was gaining popularity in middle-class homes: board games. An inspiration struck. Lizzie Magie got to work creating a game that was an expression of her political beliefs. It leaned heavily on the teachings of Henry George. It took the principles in his book and brought them to life in the dynamics of a board game. She called her game the Landlord's game. Modern players would immediately recognize it as an early version of Monopoly. It was complete with 4 railroad squares, chance cards, a go-to-jail stop, and a luxury tax. Magie's original chance cards had quotations on them, including one from the wealthy industrialist Andrew Carnegie, saying, "The greatest astonishment of my life was the discovery that the man who does the work is not the man who gets rich." The Landlord's game had 2 sets of rules. The first set of rules were much like modern Monopoly. The aim was to dominate the board and be the last man standing. But using the second set of rules, income derived from rent was paid into a public treasury and reinvested in the community. In January 1904, the US Patent Office issued Lizzie Magie a patent on her new creation. The game became popular with left-wing intellectuals and on college campuses, and that popularity spread throughout the next 3 decades. It eventually caught on with a community of Protestant Christians known as Quakers in Atlantic City, in America's Northeast. The Quakers customized the game, created their own boards, and named the properties after real places in and around Atlantic City. It was these homemade boards, along with the 1904 patent, that would be key in Ralph Anspach's legal battle with Parker Brothers. Having uncovered Lizzie Magie's patents, the original from 1904 and a renewed patent from 1924, Ralph Anspach questioned how Charles Darrow was able to get his 1935 patent. It was a mystery. Anspach took out newspaper ads looking for early Monopoly players and traveled across the US to interview them. Before the 19th century, games, much like folk music, was passed from player to player. These folk games were constantly evolving and not owned by any single person or entity. Anspach finds players all across the country who were playing versions of Monopoly on their own boards long before the Darrow patent. Ralph Anspach believes this is the evidence he needs to defeat Parker Brothers' lawsuit, but his lawyers disagree. They think he needs more. Anspach is introduced to the Quaker version of the game that grew out of the Atlantic City community. It so closely resembles Darrow's Monopoly that there is no way it could be a coincidence. He meets Charles and Olive Todd, who were members of the Quaker community, and they tell him a story about a friend of the family called Charles Darrow. One night in late 1932, Charles Todd and his wife Olive introduced their friends Charles and Esther Darrow to a board game they had recently learned. As the two couples sat around the board, enthusiastically rolling the dice, buying up properties and moving their tokens around, the Todds were pleased to note that the Darrows liked the game. In fact, they were so taken with it that Charles Todd made them a set of their own and began teaching them some of the more advanced rules. The game didn't have an official name. It wasn't sold in a box, but passed from friend to friend, and everybody called it the Monopoly game. One day, Darrow, who was unemployed and desperate for money to support his family, asked Charles Todd for a written copy of the rules. Todd was slightly perplexed as he had never written them up, but he did as Darrow asked. The Todds don't hear from the Darrows again until they begin to see adverts for a game called Monopoly begin to appear in the windows of Philadelphia's department stores. Charles Darrow had refined and standardized the game the Todds had taught him and self-published his own version. Hoping to cash in, Darrow approaches Parker Brothers. George Parker had retired, leaving his son-in-law, Robert Barton, at the helm of the company, and Barton initially rejects Darrow's pitch, feeling the game is too complicated, and the subject matter of mortgages, rent, and real estate were quite frankly boring. But as Darrow's self-published version of the game gathers steam, Barton has a change of heart. Believing that they could have a hit on their hands, Parker Brothers are anxious to protect their investment and their future profits. The game publisher had been disappointed when they were unable to secure patents on some of their previous games. In 1890, they published a version of the game Tiddlywinks, but it was considered too generic to trademark. In 1923, they published a version of the Chinese game of Mahjong, but the game was already widely played, so the patent was rejected. In both cases, the market became flooded with knockoff products that ate into Parker Brothers' profits. With Monopoly, they wanted to ensure that they had a monopoly. It was vital due to the company's financial position at the time. The Great Depression had a major impact on sales, and the company was on the verge of collapse. Robert Barton asks Charles Darrow if Monopoly was entirely his own creation. He assures them it is, and the deal is done in March of 1935. By June of that year, 10,000 copies of Monopoly are produced, and it sells well. Barton realized this could be the hit the company needed. Nervous that their golden goose might be snatched away by their competitors, Barton and his lawyers begin to investigate Darrow's claims. They don't like what they find. They discover games like finance and inflation, games that are remarkably similar to Monopoly, too similar, and what's worse, they predate Darrow's Monopoly patent. A closer examination of Darrow's game also reveals a curious spelling error. When Charles Todd copied his version of Monopoly from a friend, he spelled the property Marvin Gardens with an I, when the real Atlantic City neighborhood is spelt with an E. When Darrow copied Todd's board, he repeated the mistake. It's now clear that Charles Darrow's story, the one tucked inside every box of Monopoly, is a lie. In much the same way that Monopoly evolved from the folk game played by the Quaker community of Atlantic City, finance and inflation evolved from folk games played in other parts of the US. But they all had a common ancestor, one that was about to become a problem for Parker Brothers. In an effort to preserve the Charles Darrow myth and to monopolize Monopoly, Parker Brothers moved quickly to buy up the patents for finance and inflation. The game giant now holds patents on Monopoly, finance and inflation, but all three games are just derivatives of another board game, Lizzie McGee's Landlord's game. It's 1936, and Lizzie is working in Washington, D.C. as a secretary. But Monopoly's popularity can't be ignored, and Lizzie quickly realizes that Monopoly is very similar to her game. She's appalled by the fact that Charles Darrow is claiming that he invented the game, and she goes to the press. This is a disaster for Parker Brothers, and an elderly George Parker comes out of retirement and travels to Washington to persuade her to sell her patent. He offers Lizzie a deal: hand over the patent, and Parker Brothers will publish the Landlord's game and 2 other Lizzie McGee inventions. Lizzie McGee sees this as an opportunity to get the Landlord's game and the single tax movement in front of a bigger audience. She agrees to the deal and sells the rights to her game for just $500. But the deal is a bait and switch. Parker Brothers publishes 2 other Lizzie McGee titles, but does little to promote them, and they fade into obscurity. And what's worse, in 1939, when publishing the new version of the Landlord's game, the company exploits the fine print in the contract, giving them editorial control over the product. They make wholesale changes to the game, and most importantly, only include one set of rules: the monopolist rules. The single tax rules that Lizzie was so passionate about are gone. Parker Brothers only published enough copies of the Landlord's game to secure the copyright. Surviving copies of the Parker Brothers version of the game are considered by many to be the rarest of all 20th century board games. When Lizzie McGee's patent expires just 2 years later, she is erased from any material relating to the game, and her role in the development of Monopoly, the world's most popular board game, is effectively lost to history. Magie died at the age of 81 in 1948. At the time of her death, she was not credited for the impact that she had on Western culture and the board game community around the world. One of the last records of Lizzie Magie's life was in the 1940 census. She listed her occupation as maker of games and her income as 0. Lizzie Magie's story was uncovered by Ralph Anspach during his investigation into the origins of monopoly. By the late 70s, the anti-monopoly legal battle between Anspach and Parker Brothers, now owned by General Mills, had dragged on for years. Anspach had to remortgage his house to pay for his legal fees. He and his family were in real financial trouble when Parker Brothers makes him an offer. $500,000, $2 million by today's standards, and an executive position at Parker Brothers with only one catch: he can never reveal the true origins of monopoly. Anspach refused. Armed with new evidence, he wanted another day in court. That day came in early 1980, but it didn't go well. The case is heard by the same judge that ordered 40,000 anti-monopoly games be buried in a Minnesota landfill back in 1977. Anspach loses the case. The judge rules that the public could be deceived by the similarity of the names monopoly and anti-monopoly. This was disastrous for Ralph Anspach. He had lost his game, and the debts he had incurred defending himself in court were ruinous. But he was also out of options. He had to proceed with even more costly litigation and appeal the decision. Ralph's appeal makes its way through the court system until finally, in February of 1983, he finds himself presenting his case and the true origin story of monopoly to the Supreme Court. Here he wins, and he wins big. The court finds the Parker Brothers trademark to be invalid. Ralph can legally sell anti-monopoly, his legal fees are paid, and he is awarded substantial damages. If you can find a copy of Ralph Anspach's original anti-monopoly game, the description reads, "Players choose free enterprise or monopoly, then play under different rules. Competitors charge fair market value, while monopolists take over whole neighborhoods and jack up rents. In real life, monopolists have an unfair advantage, but in anti-monopoly, competitors have a fair shot at coming out on top." Anspach died in March of 2022 at the age of 96. But for the remainder of his life, he continued to tell the story of Lizzie Magie and the true origins of monopoly. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please hit the like button, consider subscribing to the channel, and check out these other videos.